I don't talk about real estate anymore. I don't talk about commissions or closing costs or the structural integrity of Victorian foundations. If you ask me what I do for a living now, I tell you I work in logistics. It's boring, it's safe, and most importantly, it deals with things that don't have memories. Boxes move from point A to point B. They don't whisper, and they don't remember who owned them before. For years, I told myself that what happened to Chris was a nervous breakdown. That was the rational explanation, the one that allowed me to sleep with the lights off. He was a man under pressure, going through a messy divorce, working 80-hour weeks to outrun his own shadow. The mind snaps. That's what minds do when you stretch them too thin. I held on to that logic like a life raft in a freezing ocean. But logic is a flimsy shield when you're standing in the dark, and the silence starts to have a texture. I'm writing this now not to warn you. It's too late for warnings, but because the smell of lavender laundry detergent triggered a panic attack in the grocery store yesterday, and I need to get this out of my head before it rots me from the inside. It was November 2008. The housing market was crashing, bleeding out value by the hour, but Chris wasn't worried. Chris was never worried. He was the kind of broker who wore three-piece Italian suits to inspect teardowns in the rain. He was my mentor, my idol, and the most aggressively skeptical man I'd ever met. To him, the world was a spreadsheet. "Houses are bricks, mortar, and wood, kid," he used to say, tapping his gold pen on the dashboard of his Mercedes. "They don't have feelings. They don't have souls. They are inventory. Treat them like cans of soup. You don't get sentimental about soup." We had a listing on Liberty Street. It was a Queen Anne revival, beautifully restored, but sitting on the market for 6 months like a cursed object. The price had dropped twice. The previous owners had left in a hurry. Job relocation, they said. It was the standard excuse people use when they need to flee without admitting why. We scheduled an open house for a Tuesday evening, a twilight tour designed for high-end buyers who worked late. It was a mistake from the start. The weather turned foul by 4 p.m., a freezing horizontal rain that rattled the windows like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry crowd. By 5:30 p.m., the house was silent. Just the two of us, entombed in that cavernous, overpriced structure. The electricity had been spotty, so the staging lamps cast long, sickly yellow shadows across the hardwood floors. I was in the kitchen, uselessly arranging a plate of store-bought cookies that were slowly going stale in the damp air. Chris was in the living room, pacing. I could hear the click-clack of his expensive shoes, a metronome of impatience. "Dead night," Chris muttered, walking into the kitchen and checking his Rolex. "Waste of time. We should lock up." I remember the boredom, that thick, suffocating boredom that makes you stare at the floral patterns in the wallpaper until they seem to shift and crawl. I was just hoping a client, any client, would show up so we could justify the time. The first thing I noticed wasn't a sound. It was the smell. When we arrived, the house smelled of lemon polish and dust, the standard sterile scent of an empty home. But around 6 p.m., the air changed. It didn't drift in, it assaulted us. It became heavy, humid, and cloying. A scent drifted from the hallway that had no business being in a winter storm. It smelled like baby powder and wet earth, like a nursery that had been left open to a swamp. "Did you leave a window open upstairs?" Chris called out. His voice sounded tight, losing its usual smooth, sales pitch cadence. "No," I replied, walking into the foyer, wiping cookie crumbs from my hands. "Why?" "It's freezing in here." He was right. The temperature hadn't just dropped, it had plummeted. I could see the white vapor of my breath huffing into the air. But it wasn't a uniform cold. It was localized. Standing near the bottom of the grand staircase, the air felt solid, pressing against my skin like a wet, icy sheet. Chris was standing at the foot of the stairs, looking up. The darkness on the second-floor landing seemed thicker than it should have been. It didn't look like the absence of light. It looked like a physical mass, like black ink spilled in clear water, swirling and settling. "I heard something," Chris said. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to the stairs. "Probably the pipes, Chris. Old plumbing," I said, reciting the line he taught me to use on nervous clients who heard the house settling. He didn't laugh. He didn't mock me for stating the obvious. He took a step up, his hand hovering over the banister without touching it. "It sounded like splashing." There was no water in the house. We had shut the main valve off ourselves in the basement 3 hours ago to prevent the pipes from freezing. I knew this for a fact because I had held the flashlight while he turned the rusty wheel. Chris walked up the stairs. I stayed at the bottom. I wanted to follow him, to be the dutiful assistant, but my legs felt heavy, as if the gravity in the foyer had doubled. I watched his polished Oxfords disappear onto the landing. Then came the sound. It wasn't a creak. It was a wet, rhythmic slap. 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 Coming from the hallway above. It sounded exactly like wet, bare feet running on hardwood. The sound was heavy, sodden, implying a weight that shouldn't be there. "Hello?" Chris's voice cracked. The arrogance, the bricks-and-mortar confidence was gone. He sounded like a lost child. I stood paralyzed. My hand gripped the newel post of the banister for support. It felt wrong. The wood was damp. I pulled my hand away and looked at my palm. It was coated in a clear, viscous slime. It didn't smell like water from a leak. It smelled stagnant. It smelled like pond scum. "Chris, let's go," I whispered. My throat was so dry it hurt. "Let's just leave the lights on." "She's in the nursery," Chris said from upstairs. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, detached from reality. "The door is locked." I hadn't told Chris, but I knew the floor plan better than he did. There was no nursery. The previous owners were an elderly couple who used the rooms for storage. The room he was referring to was a guest study. "Chris, come down! There is no nursery!" I yelled, my voice echoing too loudly in the empty space. I forced myself up the stairs. The air grew colder with every step, a biting frost that stung my eyes and made my skin crawl. When I reached the landing, the smell of wet earth was overpowering, choking me, tasting of algae and rot. Chris was standing outside the third door on the left. The door was white, pristine, contrasting sharply with the gloom. But from underneath the frame, water was seeping out. Dark, murky water. It pooled around Chris's shoes, soaking into his expensive leather, staining the hallway rug black. He wasn't trying to open the door. He was holding the doorknob with both hands, leaning his forehead against the wood. He was shaking violently, a vibration that I could feel through the floorboards. "I didn't mean to," Chris whispered. The sound of his voice will haunt me forever. It wasn't fearful. It was shattered. I didn't mean to look away. The water kept coming. It wasn't just a leak. The volume was impossible. It flowed over his shoes, reaching the edge of the hallway runner. Then the doorknob turned. Not from Chris's hand, but from the inside. The mechanism clicked, a sharp, mechanical sound, like a breaking bone. The door didn't open. Instead, a force slammed against it from the inside. Thud. The impact was so strong the dust fell from the ceiling fixture. Thud. "Daddy?" The voice came from behind the door. It wasn't a ghost's wail. It wasn't spectral. It was small, gurgling, and terrifyingly hyper-realistic. It sounded like a child trying to speak with lungs full of fluid. It bubbled. Chris screamed. It wasn't a scream of terror. It was a scream of absolute, soul-crushing grief. He let go of the knob and fell backward, scrambling away on his hands and feet like a frightened animal. "Get me out!" he shrieked, his eyes wide, staring at the door. Don't let her open it! Don't let her look at me!" I grabbed him by the collar of his suit. He was dead weight, sobbing uncontrollably. I dragged him toward the stairs. As we stumbled down, I looked back one last time. The door was inching open. Just a crack. In the darkness of that crack, I saw an eye. It was blue, wide, and the pupil was blown out, fixed and unseeing. And below the eye, wet gray skin. It stared right through me, focused entirely on the sobbing man I was dragging down the stairs. We scrambled out the front door, leaving the lights on, leaving the keys, leaving the front door wide open to the storm. We drove in silence. Chris stared out the window, shivering, his expensive shoes squelching with that dark, foul-smelling water, ruining the floor mats of his car. Chris never entered a house again. He quit the firm the next day via email. He moved to a condo in the city, somewhere high up, concrete, strictly modern, no history, no attics, no basements. I didn't see him for 5 years. I thought the house on Liberty Street was haunted. I thought we had stumbled upon a ghost of a child who died there decades ago. That was the story I told myself to sleep at night. Just a ghost. Just a tragedy from 1920. Sad, but nothing to do with us. Last week, I ran into Chris's ex-wife at a coffee shop. We made small talk, the kind that dances around the elephant in the room. Finally, I asked about Chris. "He's okay," she said, looking away, tracing the rim of her cup. "He still has nightmares about the lake house." "The lake house?" I asked, confused. "I didn't know you guys had a lake house. I thought you lived in the suburbs." "We did," she said softly. "Before the divorce, before the accident." She took a sip of her coffee, her hand trembling slightly. "We lost our daughter Sarah in 2005. Chris was supposed to be watching her. He was on a phone call, closing a big commercial deal. She wandered onto the dock. She fell in." My blood ran cold. The noise of the coffee shop faded into a buzzing silence. "She was found 2 hours later," she continued, her voice breaking. "Under the dock, caught in the weeds." I froze. I thought back to that night on Liberty Street. The smell of wet earth and pond scum. The splashing sound. The gurgling voice calling, "Daddy." The water seeping under the door that smelled of a stagnant lake, not a burst pipe. I realized then, with a nausea that nearly floored me, that the Liberty Street house wasn't haunted by a ghost that lived there. It hadn't shown us a Victorian tragedy. The house had read Chris. It had tasted his guilt. There was no ghost child in that room belonging to the house's history. The house had simply reached into Chris's memory, pulled out his worst moment, the moment his daughter drowned while he was busy selling a building, and replayed it for him in high definition. It used his own trauma as a weapon. The eye I saw in the crack of the door wasn't a demon. It was Sarah. Or, rather, it was what Sarah looked like when they pulled her out of the water. The house on Liberty Street is still there. I drove by it yesterday. A young couple was moving in. They were laughing, carrying boxes labeled kitchen and bedroom. I saw a crib being carried through the front door. I wanted to stop. I wanted to roll down my window and scream at them to run. But I didn't. Because I realized something else, something far worse. The house didn't attack me. It didn't show me anything. It ignored me completely. It only wanted Chris. It's a predator. And like any predator, it doesn't just kill indiscriminately. It hunts for the weak spot. It hunts for the guilt you carry. And if you have none, well, maybe you're safe. But who among us doesn't have a locked door in their mind that they're terrified to open? I drove past, and for a second, I swear I saw the curtains in the upper bedroom move. Not from the wind, but like someone was parting them. Watching fresh meat arrive, waiting to see what secrets they brought with them to feed on. The smell of wet plaster still makes me gag. It's a specific, chalky scent that sits in the back of your throat, coating your tongue like dissolved aspirin. Most people associate that smell with progress, with new beginnings and home renovations. I associate it with the winter of 1995 and the sound of teeth grinding against bone in a room that was supposed to be empty. I haven't walked into a kitchen in the dark for 30 years. If I need water in the middle of the night, I drink from the bathroom tap. My wife thinks it's a quirk, a lingering habit from living in old houses with bad plumbing. I let her believe that. It's easier than explaining that I'm afraid I'll interrupt a meal that has been going on for decades. It was just me and my father that winter. My mother had left in the autumn, a quiet, suitcase-packing departure that my father refused to discuss. To fill the silence she left behind, he bought a foreclosure on the edge of town. It was a sprawling, rotting Victorian wreck that he was determined to flip before the market turned. He wasn't a carpenter, but he was a man who believed that grief could be sweated out. If he kept his hands busy, he wouldn't have to think about why she left. We lived in the house while we worked on it. That was the first mistake. The heating system was shot, so we slept in sleeping bags in the living room, huddled around a kerosene heater that smelled of jet fuel. The kitchen was the main project. It was a disaster of peeling linoleum and water-damaged cabinets. We gutted it down to the studs. For weeks, our life was a cycle of demolition. We ripped out the old farmhouse sink. We tore down the soffits. We pulled up layers of flooring that were sticky with decades of grease. By December, the kitchen was a skeleton. Exposed beams, wires hanging like black vines, and insulation spilling out of the walls like pink cotton candy. The noises started in January, during a blizzard that buried the first-floor windows in snow. At first, we rationalized it. Old houses breathe. They settle. Thermal expansion. My father had a scientific explanation for everything. When we heard the thud, thud, thud coming from the kitchen at 2 a.m., he said it was the wind rattling the loose siding. "Just the house shivering, son," he'd say, turning over in his sleeping bag. "Go back to sleep." But wind doesn't sound like silverware. I lay awake, listening. It wasn't just banging. It was the distinct metallic clatter of a fork hitting a plate. Then the shk-shk of a knife sawing through something tough. It was the rhythm of dining, deliberate, paced. I tried to tell myself it was rats. We had seen droppings, after all. But rats don't open and close cupboard doors. And that was the other sound, the creak slam of the upper cabinets. The cabinets we had emptied. The cabinets that held nothing but dust. One morning, I went into the kitchen before my father woke up. The room was freezing, the breath clouding in front of my face. I walked over to the counter where we had left a box of donuts the night before. The box was torn open, not gnawed by a rodent, but ripped. And inside, the donuts were gone. In their place was a single raw pork chop. It was sitting directly on the dusty counter. It was gray, cold, and covered in sawdust. We hadn't bought pork chops. We were living on pizza and takeout burgers. I stared at the meat, my stomach turning. It looked chewed, but not swallowed, just masticated and spat back out, as if the eater couldn't stomach the texture. When I showed my father, he turned pale, but his denial was a fortress. "A stray animal must have got in," he muttered, tossing the meat into the trash bag with a shovel. "We need to board up that hole behind the stove tighter." He was referring to a gap in the drywall we had opened up to route new piping. It led into the dark void between the kitchen wall and the old servants' pantry, a dead space. We nailed a piece of plywood over it that afternoon. My father used twice as many nails as necessary. He hammered them in with a violence that scared me. He wasn't fixing a wall. He was trying to kill something. The activity didn't stop. It changed. The next night, the sounds weren't polite dining noises. They were frantic. It sounded like a frantic search. Cupboards slammed open and shut in rapid succession. Bang, bang, bang! Drawers were pulled out and dumped onto the floor. I lay in my sleeping bag, paralyzed. The kerosene heater cast long, dancing shadows on the ceiling. Beside me, my father was awake. I could tell by his breathing. He was listening too. "Dad?" I whispered. "Quiet," he hissed. Then, the smell hit us. It wasn't the smell of old grease or rot anymore. It was the smell of cooking. But it was wrong. It smelled like burning hair and scorched sugar, a sweet, acrid stench that made my eyes water. "Something's burning," I said, sitting up. "Dad, the house is on fire." He grabbed his flashlight and a crowbar. We moved toward the kitchen. The hallway was freezing, but as we got closer to the kitchen archway, the air grew thick and warm. My father kicked the plastic sheeting we had hung over the doorway aside. The kitchen was empty. There was no fire. The stove was disconnected, sitting in the middle of the room, cold as a tombstone. But the room was in chaos. The few tools we had left on the counters were scattered. The trash bag, the one with the chewed pork chop, had been ripped open, its contents strewn across the floor in a wet, garbage-streaked circle. And in the center of that circle sat a plate. One of our paper plates. On it was a pile of insulation, the pink fiberglass stuff from the walls. It was mounded up like mashed potatoes, and stuck into it, upright, was a rusty spoon we had found under the floorboards weeks ago. The spoon was wet. My father dropped the crowbar. The clang echoed like a gunshot. "That's it," he said, his voice trembling. "We're sleeping at the motel." We left that night. We came back only in the daylight to finish the bare minimum of the work. My father refused to work past 4 p.m. We sealed the walls up. We put in the new cabinets. We laid the new floor. We buried the history of that room under layers of drywall and laminate. We sold the house 3 months later to a young couple. My father made a profit. He used the money to move us to a different state, far away from the snow and the smell of wet plaster. I grew up. I went to college. I tried to forget the sound of that invisible feast. I told myself it was carbon monoxide poisoning from the kerosene heater, hallucinations brought on by stress and fumes. It was a neat, tidy explanation. 2 years ago, I received a call from an old friend who still lived in that town. He knew my dad had passed away, and he hesitated before telling me the news. "Did you hear about the Liberty Street house?" he asked. "The one you guys fixed up?" "No," I said, feeling a cold prickle on the back of my neck. "What about it?" "The current owners were doing a remodel. They wanted to expand the kitchen. They tore down that wall, the one between the kitchen and the pantry." My hand gripped the phone. That was the wall we had boarded up, the wall with the dead space. "They found something, didn't they?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Yeah," he said. "They found a sleeping bag and a lot of wrappers, candy bars, cans, and bones." I closed my eyes. "A squatter?" "Not exactly," my friend said. "The police identified him. It was the previous owner's son. The family that lost the house to foreclosure before your dad bought it? They had a son, about 20 years old. Heavy drug user, mental health issues. Everyone thought he ran away when the parents were evicted." I stopped breathing. "He didn't run away," my friend continued. "He hid. He crawled into the crawl space behind the pantry to hide from the eviction marshals. He must have been living in the walls the whole time you guys were renovating." The timeline crashed down on me with the weight of a sledgehammer. The sounds, The footsteps, the food disappearing. It wasn't a ghost. It was a starving, terrified boy hiding inches away from us, listening to us destroy his home. The chewed pork chop. He had tried to eat it raw because he had no way to cook, but he couldn't stomach it. The night of the feast with the insulation, he was hallucinating from hunger. He was eating fiberglass because his stomach was so empty it was digesting itself. And then, the silence. I remembered the day my father nailed the plywood over the hole. He used twice as many nails. He hammered them with anger. "We need to board up that hole tighter," he had said. We didn't just fix a wall. We sealed him in. When the noises stopped, we thought the ghost had gone away. We congratulated ourselves on driving out the spirits. But the banging hadn't stopped because the ghost left. It stopped because he got too weak to hit the wall. He died in the dark, curled up in a sleeping bag, waiting for us to leave so he could scavenge a crumb of food. And we, thinking we were haunted, simply built a nice, clean kitchen right over his grave. Now, when I hear a cabinet door close in the other room, I don't get scared of the supernatural. I get scared of the physics. I get scared of the fact that a human being can exist in the spaces we choose not to look at. I don't go into kitchens at night, because I know what hunger sounds like when it's desperate enough to eat glass. And I know that sometimes the monsters aren't the ones scratching inside the walls. Sometimes the monsters are the ones on the outside, holding the hammers, sealing the tomb, and calling it home improvement. I cannot walk down the first aid aisle of a pharmacy anymore. The moment that sharp, sterile scent of isopropyl alcohol hits my nostrils, my throat closes up. To most people, that smell means cleanliness, a stinging swipe before a vaccination, or the coolness of a fever patch. To me, it smells of accusation. It smells of a marriage dissolving in slow motion, and the damp, heavy weight of a secret that was rotting right above our heads. I grew up in a house where the word alcohol was treated with the same hushed, fearful reverence as the word cancer. My parents were strict Southern Baptists, the kind who believed that a single drop of liquor was a cracked door through which the devil could slide his entire body. Our home on the outskirts of Atlanta was a dry fortress. We didn't have wine for cooking. We didn't have vanilla extract if the alcohol content was too high. That is why the smell was so violent. It started in the summer of 1996. I was 12, old enough to know the rules, but young enough to be terrified of breaking them. The house was a sprawling, single-story ranch we had inherited from a distant great-uncle I never met. It was a dark place, shaded by ancient oak trees that draped moss over the roof like ragged gray hair. The first time it happened, we were watching television. It was a Tuesday. Suddenly, the air in the living room shifted. It didn't waft in, it arrived. A thick, cloying cloud of what smelled like cheap gin and rubbing alcohol. It was so strong it made my eyes water. My father paused the TV. He stood up, his nostrils flaring, his face hardening into a mask of righteous fury. He turned to my mother. "Susan?" he asked. The word wasn't a question, it was an indictment. "It's not me, David," she whispered, her face pale. "You know it's not me." They searched the room. They searched the trash cans. They found nothing. The smell vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind only the metallic taste of adrenaline. But it came back. It always came back. Over the next few months, the phantom drunk, as I secretly called him, became the third parent in our household. The smell would materialize in the hallway at 3 a.m., waking me from a dead sleep. It smelled medicinal, sharp, and cold. Sometimes it was accompanied by sounds, heavy, stumbling thuds against the wall, like a man too intoxicated to keep his balance. I remember lying in bed, pulling the quilt up to my nose to block out the stench, listening to the thump, drag, thump coming from the attic access panel in the hallway ceiling. "He's up there," I told my dad one morning over breakfast. "The drunk man. He's sleeping in the attic." My father slammed his hand on the table. "There is no man, son. It's your mother's—" He stopped, catching himself, but the damage was done. He believed my mother was a closet alcoholic, hiding bottles in the vents, sneaking up to the attic to drink herself into a stupor. The house began to feel sick. The wallpaper in the hallway started to peel, curling down in wet, sticky strips. A dark stain appeared on the ceiling, right around the attic hatch. It looked like a Rorschach test made of grease. One night in October, the activity escalated. The smell was so potent it was suffocating. I woke up coughing, my lungs burning as if I had inhaled acid. The hallway was freezing. I heard a sound that froze my blood. It wasn't the stumbling thud. It was a sloshing. It sounded like a bathtub being agitated. Heavy, liquid movement. Sloosh, splash, sloosh. I crept out of my room. The stain on the ceiling had grown. It was glistening in the moonlight. And as I watched, a single drop of liquid formed at the center of the dark patch. It hung there for a second, heavy and viscous, before falling. Plip! It hit the hallway runner. It didn't look like water. It was brownish yellow. I looked up at the attic hatch. It was vibrating. Not much, but enough to shake dust loose. Thump, thump, thump. Something was up there, and it was knocking to get out. Or maybe it was knocking to be let in. My father burst into the hallway, a flashlight in one hand and a Bible in the other. He didn't look at the ceiling. He looked at my mother's bedroom door. "Open up, Susan," he screamed. "I know you're doing this. I can smell the spillage." He tore the house apart that night. He ripped open cushions. He smashed vases. He was hunting for bottles that didn't exist, driven mad by a smell that defied physics. He never went into the attic. He was too focused on the earthly sin he thought was happening at eye level. We moved out 2 months later. My parents divorced within the year. My father couldn't live with a woman he believed was a liar and a drunk. My mother couldn't live with a man who didn't trust her. The house, and the smell, had successfully surgically removed the heart of our family. I spent the next 20 years blaming a ghost. I built a mythology around it. I told myself it was the spirit of a Prohibition bootlegger who died in the attic, his spectral stills leaking into our reality. It was a cool story to tell at parties. It made the tragedy of my parents' divorce feel mystical rather than pathetic. Then, last year, I got a letter from the County Historical Society. They were doing a retrospective on the properties in the area, and they wanted to know if I had any photos of the doctor's house. I called the historian. "Doctor's house?" I asked. "My uncle was an accountant." "No, not him," the woman on the phone said cheerfully. "The owner before him, Dr. Eris Thorne. He was quite the figure in the 1950s. A brilliant man, but eccentric. He was a taxidermist, an amateur cryptozoologist, really." I felt a cold numbness spread through my fingers. Taxidermist? Yes. He was obsessed with preservation. He believed he could perfect a solution that would keep tissues viable forever. He used a mixture of high-grade ethanol, formaldehyde, and, well, other things. "Ethanol," I whispered. "Alcohol." Exactly. When the new owners renovated the roof last month, they found his storage. Storage? He had walled off a section of the attic, she continued, oblivious to the sound of my world collapsing. He didn't trust banks, or perhaps he just ran out of space. They found 42 industrial glass carboys, those big 5-gallon jugs, hidden under the insulation. She laughed, a light, airy sound. The heat up there over the decades. The seals had disintegrated. The fluid had been evaporating and leaking into the floorboards for 50 years. Can you imagine the smell? I hung up the phone. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a bootlegger. And it certainly wasn't my mother. The sloshing I heard wasn't a spirit. It was the liquid in those 42 jugs, shifting as the house settled in the wind. The thumping wasn't a drunkard stumbling. It was the sound of gases expanding in the heat, the glass jars vibrating against the wooden joists, effectively boiling in the Georgia summer. And the drop, that yellow, viscous drop that fell on the rug, that wasn't ectoplasm. It was a soup of ethanol and formaldehyde that had been marinating whatever Dr. Thorne had put inside those jars. The historian hadn't mentioned what was in the jars. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. But I remembered the wobbly man I used to imagine. I realized that the smell I had inhaled for years, the smell that coated my lungs and destroyed my family, wasn't the smell of a vice. It was the smell of a tomb. We had been living inside a jar. We were just the only things in the house that were still breathing. My father died thinking my mother was a monster. My mother died thinking my father was a tyrant. And all the while, the truth was just 6 feet above their heads, pickling in the dark, waiting for the seal to break. Now, when I smell rubbing alcohol, I don't just feel fear. I feel a profound, crushing sorrow. Because ghosts are easy to deal with. You can banish a ghost, but you can't banish a leak. And you certainly can't banish the fact that we let a chemical reaction destroy a marriage because it was easier to blame each other than to look up at the ceiling. There is a specific hierarchy to childhood friendships that you don't question until you're old enough to realize how messed up it was. In 1996, Eric Robinson was at the top of the food chain, and I was the krill. He was the kind of kid who had scraped knees that never seemed to heal, and a laugh that sounded like a bark. He was my tormentor on the playground, stealing my lunch money, tripping me in the hallway. But on the weekends, he was my best friend. It was a hostage situation disguised as companionship. I tolerated the abuse because standing next to the monster was safer than standing in front of him. The night he slept over was supposed to be a peace treaty. My parents had just bought the Liberty Street house, a drafty, creaking structure that smelled of cedar and wet dog. They were eager to help me socialize, oblivious to the fact that inviting Eric over was like inviting a wolf to guard the sheep. We set up camp in the basement. That was Eric's idea, of course. To me, the basement was a no-go zone. It was unfinished, a cavern of poured concrete and exposed ductwork that seemed to amplify the temperature of the earth outside. In November, it was a meat locker. The only light came from the street lamps filtering through 2 narrow hopper windows set high in the wall, right at ground level with the backyard. "We're sleeping down here," Eric announced, throwing his sleeping bag onto the cold concrete floor. "Unless you're scared." "I'm not scared," I lied. I was terrified. Not of ghosts, but of the dark, of the cold, and of Eric. We spent the first few hours doing standard 12-year-old things. We played Game Boy by flashlight, ate stale pretzels, and Eric told exaggerated stories about fights he had won. But as the hours ticked by and the house settled into silence, the atmosphere in the basement changed. The air grew heavy. The shadows cast by the furnace seemed to stretch and grab at the walls. Around 2 a.m., the wind died down outside. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that rings in your ears. "You hear that?" Eric whispered. He was sitting bolt upright in his sleeping bag, his back rigid. "Hear what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The walking." I strained my ears. I heard the refrigerator humming upstairs. I heard the house settling. But then I heard it too. It wasn't inside the basement. It was outside. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was the sound of heavy boots walking on the dead leaves in the backyard. Slow, deliberate. The footsteps circled the perimeter of the house, getting closer to the basement windows. "It's just a deer," I whispered, pulling my blanket up to my chin. "Deer don't stop," Eric hissed. The footsteps had stopped, right outside the hopper window above Eric's head. We both froze. The window was covered in grime and cobwebs, a small rectangle of gray night. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a sound that made my blood turn to ice. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Someone was running a fingernail or a knife down the glass. I waited for Eric to yell, to jump up and bang on the window to scare the intruder away. That's what Eric did. He was the brave one. He was the fighter. But Eric didn't move. He was trembling. In the pale light, I saw his face. It wasn't the face of a bully. It was the face of a prey animal caught in a trap. His eyes were wide, fixed on that window, and tears were streaming down his cheeks. He wasn't breathing. "Don't look," he whispered, his voice so faint I almost missed it. "If you don't look, he can't come in." "Who?" I asked. "The Shadow Man," Eric choked out. The scratching stopped. Then, a voice drifted through the glass. It was muffled, distorted by the pain, but it was distinct. It wasn't a ghostly moan. It was a low, rhythmic chanting. It sounded angry. "I see you, little rat. I see where you hide." I scrambled out of my sleeping bag. "I'm getting my dad," I said. Eric lunged at me, grabbing my wrist with a grip that left bruises. "No!" he shrieked, his eyes wild. "Don't! If you wake them up, he'll get in. He'll kill everyone. You have to be quiet." He was sobbing now, a hysterical, silent weeping that shook his entire body. He dragged me down to the floor. We lay there in the dark, huddled together on the freezing concrete. Eric covered his ears with his hands and squeezed his eyes shut, rocking back and forth. "Go away, go away, go away," he chanted under his breath. The voice outside continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes it was a whisper, sometimes it was a low growl. It walked around the house, tapping on the siding, scratching at the window. Tap, 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 like a code. I eventually passed out from sheer exhaustion, the cold seeping into my bones. When I woke up, the sun was streaming through the dirty window. The terror of the night felt distant, like a fever dream. But Eric was already packing. He looked awful. His skin was gray, his eyes rimmed with red. He didn't say a word to me. He rolled up his sleeping bag, threw his backpack over his shoulder, and marched upstairs. My mom tried to offer him pancakes. "I have to go," Eric said, looking at the floor. He wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. He walked out the front door and ran down the street. He never came back to my house. In fact, he stopped bullying me. He stopped acknowledging my existence entirely. We drifted into different social circles. I became the invisible kid. He became the burnout, smoking behind the bleachers, getting into fights that he started losing more and more often. I always told the story as a ghost story, the night of the Shadow Man. I told people we were haunted by a demon that tormented bullies. I believed the house had a spirit that targeted Eric because he was mean. It felt like justice. It felt like the house was protecting me. 10 years later, I was back in town for the holidays. I was at a dive bar nursing a beer when I saw a guy at the end of the bar who looked familiar. It was Eric. He looked 20 years older than he was, gaunt, with a scar running through his eyebrow. I walked over. "Eric?" He looked up, his eyes glassy. He recognized me, and a flicker of that old fear crossed his face. "Hey," he said. We made small talk. It was awkward. Finally, the alcohol gave me the courage to ask. Man, do you remember that sleepover at my folks' place on Liberty Street? Eric stiffened. He put his drink down. I remember, he said. That ghost, man, I laughed nervously. That was crazy. The scratching on the window freaked me out for years. Eric looked at me. He looked at me with a pity that I didn't understand. It wasn't a ghost, he said quietly. What do you mean? We both heard it. The voice, the tapping. Eric took a long pull of his beer. It was my dad. The noise of the bar seemed to drop away. What? My dad, Eric repeated. He was a bad guy. A really bad guy. That night, I didn't sleep over because I wanted to hang out with you. I slept over because he was on a bender, and he had threatened to put me in the hospital. I stared at him, my mouth dry. He followed me, Eric continued, staring at the bottles behind the bar. He followed me to your house. He waited until the lights went out. Then he crept into your backyard. He spent the whole night crouching by that basement window, whispering to me, telling me what he was going to do to me when I came home. Scratching the glass with his pocket knife, just to let me know he could get in if he wanted to. My stomach turned over. I thought about the shadow man. I thought about 12-year-old Eric, the tough guy, curled up on the concrete floor, sobbing, begging me not to wake my parents because he was afraid his father would hurt my family if he was discovered. He wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting me. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered. Because, Eric said, shrugging. If I told you, then it was real. If I pretended it was a ghost, maybe it would go away. He finished his drink and stood up. I gotta go. Nice seeing you. I watched him walk out into the cold night. I thought about the house on Liberty Street. I had always thought of it as a haunted place, a place of supernatural dread. But I was wrong. The house was a sanctuary. It was the only thing standing between a terrified boy and a monster. The horror wasn't that the dead could walk. The horror was that a grown man could spend 6 hours in the freezing rain, tormenting his own son through a pane of glass, just because he could. I never told that story again. It wasn't mine to tell. And it wasn't a ghost story. It was a story about how monsters don't need ectoplasm to ruin your life. Sometimes, they just need a driver's license and a child to break. I realized then that while I was scared of the noises in the dark, Eric was living in a horror movie that didn't end when the sun came up. Mirrors have always made me uncomfortable, but not for the reasons you might think. I don't fear seeing something standing behind me, and I don't fear the Bloody Mary games that children play at sleepovers. I fear the mirror because it is a slow-motion recording of a tragedy. It shows you the genetic destiny etched into your bone structure, the inevitable slide of your face into the faces of those who came before you. I look in the mirror now, at 40 years old, and I see the ghost that haunted my childhood bedroom. We moved into the house on Liberty Street in the autumn of 1997. It was just my mother and me. My father had left the picture years prior, a faded Polaroid in a shoebox we never opened. My mother was a creature of intense, frantic vanity. She was beautiful in a brittle, high-maintenance way. She spent hours in front of her vanity table, applying creams, serums, and masks, fighting the passage of time with the desperation of a soldier holding a losing line. "We have to look our best, darling," she would say, patting her cheeks until they were pink. "The world eats you alive if you look tired." The house was too big for us. It had a long, drafty hallway and a mother-in-law suite at the back that was perpetually locked. My mother told me it was unsafe, filled with asbestos and lead paint, a zone of contamination that I was never, under any circumstances, to enter. I obeyed. I was a quiet child, prone to asthma and anxiety, and I preferred the safety of my quilt to the adventure of disobedience. The visits began in November, coinciding with the first hard frost. I woke up because the air in my room had changed. It wasn't just cold, it was stale. It smelled of camphor, menthol rub, and something faintly uriniferous, like a nursing home that hadn't been aired out. I rolled over, blinking into the darkness, and saw her. She was standing at the foot of my bed. She was small, hunched over, as if her spine had fused into a question mark. Her hair was thin, white wisps floating around a scalp that shone in the moonlight. But it was her face that stopped my heart. She looked exactly like my mother. But it was my mother viewed through a funhouse mirror, melted, sagging, ruined. The skin hung loosely off her jaw. The eyes were sunken into deep, dark sockets. She was wearing a tattered nightgown that hung off her skeletal frame. She didn't look at me with malice. She looked at me with a profound, confused longing. I tried to scream, but my asthma clamped my throat shut. I could only wheeze. The figure reached out a hand, a claw of arthritic knuckles and liver spots, and patted my foot through the blanket. Pat, pat, pat. The touch was rhythmic, soothing, but to me it felt like the touch of the grave. Then she turned and shuffled out of the room. She didn't float. She walked with a heavy, dragging limp. Scuff, drag, scuff. The next morning I told my mother. I was hysterical, crying over my cereal. "There was a witch," I sobbed. "She looked like you, but old and dead." My mother froze. She dropped the spoon she was holding. Clatter. Milk splashed onto the table. For a second, her mask of composure slipped, and I saw genuine terror in her eyes. But she recovered instantly. "It was a nightmare, baby," she said, her voice tight. "Just a bad dream." "Maybe you saw my coat on the rack. Shadows play tricks." She stood up abruptly and went to the sink, scrubbing a plate that was already clean. "Don't be silly. There are no such things as witches." But the visits continued. Every few nights, the old mother, as I called her in my head, would return. She became bolder. One night, I woke up to find her sitting in the rocking chair in the corner of my room. The chair was moving back and forth. Creak, creak, creak. She was muttering to herself. It wasn't a language I understood. It was a stream of gibberish broken by sudden, lucid words. "Baby, cold, key, where?" I lay paralyzed, watching her through the slits of my eyes. The resemblance to my mother was uncanny, terrifying. It felt like a premonition. I was convinced I was seeing a ghost of my mother's future self, a spectral warning of what happened when the beauty cream stopped working. One night, the entity came close. Too close. I woke to the smell of sour breath right in my face. She was leaning over me, her face inches from mine. Up close, the horror was visceral. I could see the milky cataracts in her eyes. I could see the rogue hairs on her chin. "Alice?" she whispered. Alice was my mother's name. "Alice, I'm hungry." I screamed. I found my voice and I shrieked, kicking out with my legs. I connected with her chest. It wasn't air. It was solid bone and frail flesh. The old woman gasped, stumbling back and hitting the wall with a sickening thud. The door to my bedroom burst open. My mother stood there, silhouetted by the hall light. "Get out!" my mother screamed. But she wasn't screaming at the ghost. She was screaming at me to stop kicking. She rushed into the room, but she didn't run to comfort me. She ran to the ghost. She grabbed the old woman by the shoulders, not roughly, but with a desperate urgency. "Mama, come on," my mother hissed, tears streaming down her face. "You can't be here. You have to go back. Come on." She steered the confused, weeping entity out of the room. I sat in my bed, shaking, listening to the scuff, drag, scuff fade down the hallway, followed by the sound of a heavy door locking and a bolt sliding home. The next morning, my mother sat me down. She looked exhausted, her makeup unable to hide the dark circles under her eyes. "We need to talk about your dream," she said. "It wasn't a dream," I whispered. "You were there. You talked to her." "It was a sleepwalking episode," she lied. Her voice was steel. "I was sleepwalking. You were sleepwalking. We all have stress. I don't want to hear another word about old women or ghosts. Do you understand me? If you talk about this, people will think you're crazy. They'll take you away from me." That threat silenced me. I buried the memory. I convinced myself I had hallucinated the whole thing. The old mother never came back to my room, though sometimes, late at night, I would hear thumping coming from the asbestos suite at the back of the house. We moved out 2 years later. Life went on. My mother aged, but she never looked like the woman in my room. She kept her hair dyed, her skin treated. She died 3 years ago of a sudden stroke, beautiful to the end. I was the executor of her estate. I had to clear out her safety deposit box. Inside, amidst the deeds and the jewelry, I found a thick manila envelope labeled Medical/Legal, 1996 to 1999. I opened it. Inside was a death certificate. It was for my grandmother, Margaret. But the date of death wasn't 1990, as my mother had always told me. It was February 1999, the month we moved out of the Liberty Street house. Stapled to the certificate were medical reports. Diagnosis: advanced Alzheimer's, early onset, severe behavioral disturbances, wandering. Then I found the letters. Unsent letters my mother had written to her sister, who lived in California. "I can't afford the home anymore, Sarah. They want $4,000 a month. I can't do it. I brought Mama here. I set up the back suite for her. It's for the best. She doesn't know where she is anyway. I just have to make sure she stays quiet. If the state finds out I'm keeping her there without a nurse, they'll charge me with neglect. But I'm doing my best. She looks so much like me now. It's like looking into a cursed mirror. Sometimes she picks the lock. I have to buy a better bolt." I dropped the papers on the bank floor. The room spun. The old mother wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a demon. It was my grandmother. She hadn't died when I was a baby. She was living in the back of our house, locked in a room my mother claimed was toxic. She was starving for connection, confused, her mind erasing itself day by day. The nights she escaped, the nights she came to my room, she wasn't haunting me. She thought I was her daughter. She thought I was Alice. "Alice, I'm hungry." She wasn't trying to scare me. She was asking for help. And the resemblance. The reason she looked like a melted version of my mother was simply genetics. It was the face my mother was destined to have, the face she spent thousands of dollars trying to hide from. I thought about the kick. The night I kicked the monster in the chest. I had kicked my own grandmother, a frail, confused woman who just wanted to know where she was. And my mother. The vanity, the obsession with appearances. It wasn't just narcissism. It was fear. She was living with her own future locked in the back room. She saw what was waiting for her every time she brought a tray of food to that cell. She was trying to outrun her own DNA. Now, when I look in the mirror, I don't just see myself. I see the old mother. I see the woman who shuffled into my room looking for love, only to be met with terror and a locked door. I see the cruelty of silence. We turn our family into ghosts long before they die, just because we are too afraid to look at them. I have a daughter now. She has my eyes. Yesterday, she asked me why I always leave the bedroom door open at night. I told her it's because I never want anyone to feel like they're locked out. But the truth is, I'm waiting. I'm waiting for the shuffling sound, I'm waiting for the chance to say, "I'm sorry," to the ghost that wasn't a ghost, before my own face melts into hers.